The rancher is at the end of his rope, and the rope is fraying. Silas Blackwood stands on his porch, the Wyoming wind a constant thief, stealing warmth from his skin and resolve from his soul. The sun bleeds across the western plains, painting the vast, empty landscape in hues of heartbreak and rust. Inside the cabin, a plate of something cold and congealed sits on the table, a testament to his latest failure. Beside it, his 5-year-old son, Leo, pushes a wooden horse through a puddle of spilled milk, his silence a heavier burden than any shout. The place smells of dust, sour milk, and loneliness. It's been a year since Martha passed, and every day the silence gets louder, the dust thicker, the hole in their lives wider. He needs help, not just for the ranch, which is slipping through his calloused fingers like dry soil, but for the boy, for the hollow look in his son's eyes that mirrors the one Silas sees in his own shaving mirror. That's why he rode into Redemption yesterday, why he tacked a notice to the board outside the general store, housekeeper/cook wanted. Blackwood Ranch. Room and board provided. Must be steady. It felt like a surrender. Well, that's one way to meet. Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. Today, a wagon, small and solitary, crests the rise. It's not the buckboard of a curious neighbor or the supply wagon from town. It's something else. Silas squints, his hand shielding his eyes. A lone figure holds the reins. As it draws closer, he sees it's a woman. She handles the tired-looking horse with a quiet competence that speaks of long miles. When she pulls to a stop in the yard, the dust settling around her like a sigh, he sees a face etched with a weariness that goes beyond the road. She is not old, but not young either. Her dress is plain, dark, and mended with neat, almost invisible stitches. Her hair is pinned back in a severe bun, but stray strands have escaped to whip around a face that is pale and composed. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, take in the ramshackle state of his porch, the unswept yard, and finally him. They hold no judgment, only a deep, abiding tiredness. "I saw your notice in town," she says, her voice low and even, without a trace of hope or expectation. "I'm Alara Vance. I'm a cook." With those words, a fragile possibility enters the stale air of the ranch. The possibility of warm meals, of a swept floor, of a woman's touch that isn't a ghost. And with his gruff, desperate nod and the two words that followed, "You're hired," his life, and hers, were irrevocably changed. The first few days were a study in quiet observation. Alara Vance moved through the small, cluttered cabin like a gentle tide, not erasing what was there, but slowly, methodically, putting it to rights. Silas had expected questions, demands, perhaps a flash of dismay at the state of the larder or the layer of grime on every surface. He received none. She simply tied a clean apron over her traveling dress, rolled up her sleeves, and began. Her world, he soon learned, was contained in a single, scuffed leather trunk. She'd placed it at the foot of the narrow cot in the small storeroom he'd hastily cleared for her, a space barely bigger than a closet, but she hadn't complained. He'd caught a glimpse inside it once when she was unpacking. A few neatly folded garments, a thick wool shawl, a small, silver-backed brush, and a single, tin-framed photograph of a smiling man with kind eyes. She had closed the lid gently, a final, soft click that seemed to seal away a life he knew nothing about. She was a widow. The stark black of her dress had told him that much, but the quiet finality in that gesture told him more. It spoke of a grief as profound and as silent as his own. Silas's world was the land. It was the ache in his back from mending fences that the wind tore down as fast as he could fix them. It was the constant worry over the small herd of cattle, their ribs showing too prominently after a long, hard winter. It was the face of his son, Leo, a small, solemn moon orbiting in a universe of loss. Before Alara, the cabin had been an extension of that struggle, a place to collapse from exhaustion, not a place to live. The memory of his Martha was everywhere and nowhere at once. Her rocking chair sat empty by the cold hearth, her sewing basket collected dust on a shelf, her presence a ghost that offered no comfort, only a constant reminder of what was gone. The town of Redemption, a day's ride east, offered little solace. It was a place of necessity, of supplies and transactions, but also of pitying glances and hushed whispers. Poor Silas Blackwood, they'd say. Losing his wife like that. How's he managing with the boy? The pity felt like a brand, marking him as incomplete, as failing. He saw their judgment in the eyes of Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, whose thin lips were always pursed in disapproval of something. Her scrutiny made him feel like a man on trial. Now, a new scent began to permeate the cabin, pushing back against the ghosts and the grime. It was the smell of yeast, of baking bread. It was the savory aroma of stew simmering over the fire, rich with the few wild herbs Alara had found growing near the creek. She was a magician with his meager supplies, turning salt pork and dried beans into meals that felt like a homecoming. Leo was the first to succumb to her quiet magic. For days, he had watched her from a distance, a small, wary creature, his wooden horse clutched in his fist like a talisman. He wouldn't speak to her, would only stare with Martha's wide, brown eyes. Alara, for her part, never pushed. She simply went about her work, sometimes humming a low, sad tune that seemed to weave itself into the fabric of the quiet house. One afternoon, she set a small, perfectly browned apple tart on the table to cool. The scent was irresistible, sweet and warm. Leo crept closer, his nose twitching. Alara didn't look at him directly. She kept her attention on the dough she was kneading for the next day's bread. "My husband," she said, her voice soft, addressed to the floury board in front of her. He was partial to apple tarts. Said they tasted of sunshine. Leo stopped, his gaze fixed on the tart. He said nothing, but he took another step closer. "This one might have a bit too much cinnamon," she continued, still not looking at him. "It's hard to judge with a new stove." He reached the table, his small fingers hovering just above the flaky crust. He looked from the tart to her, then back again. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Did he like the cinnamon part?" Alara finally turned, her hands white with flour. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "He liked it best of all." She took a knife, cut a small wedge of the tart, and placed it on a tin plate. She slid it across the table toward him. "You tell me if it's right." Leo took the plate, retreated to his corner, and took a tentative bite. Silas, watching from the doorway where he'd been mending a bridle, saw his son's eyes close for a fraction of a second. It was the first sign of simple, uncomplicated pleasure he'd seen on the boy's face in a year. That night, a blizzard of nightmares descended. Silas was jerked from a shallow, exhausted sleep by Leo's screams. He rushed to his son's bedside, the boy thrashing in his cot, his face slick with sweat. "Mama," he cried, his hands reaching for a phantom. "Mama, don't go." Silas's heart clenched. He knelt, trying to gather the small, trembling body into his arms. "Shoo, son. I'm here. Papa's here," but his voice was rough, his hands clumsy with his own grief. His touch seemed to make it worse, and Leo's cries grew more frantic. Suddenly, a soft light filled the doorway. Alara stood there, holding a lamp, her hair in a long braid down her back. She wore a simple nightgown and the thick wool shawl from her trunk. She didn't ask permission. She glided to the other side of the cot, her movements calm and certain. "It's just a dream, little one," she murmured, her voice a low, soothing melody. She didn't try to hold him. Instead, she dipped a cloth in the water basin, wrung it out, and began to gently wipe his forehead. "The dreams are like storm clouds. They look big and scary, but they always pass. The sun always comes back." Leo's thrashing subsided. His sobs quieted into hiccuping breaths. He watched her, his tear-filled eyes wide in the lamplight. "I used to get them, too," she said softly, her gaze distant for a moment. "After a great storm passed over my life. I'd dream the wind was still howling. But then morning would come, and it would be quiet." She began to hum the same low, sad tune from the kitchen. It was a simple, nameless melody, but it filled the small, dark room with a sense of peace. Leo's eyelids fluttered, grew heavy, and finally closed. His breathing evened out into the deep, steady rhythm of sleep. Alara continued to hum for a few moments more, her hand resting lightly on the boy's hair. Silas remained knelt on the floor, a statue of a man, watching her. He watched the way her hand soothed, the way her voice calmed, the way her presence had brought a stillness to the room that he had been powerless to summon. It was more than competence. It was a kindness that ran bone deep. In that moment, he felt a surge of gratitude so profound it was painful. And beneath it, something else stirred, a flicker of awareness, a recognition of the woman who was not his wife, but who was right here, mending the broken pieces of his life in the dead of night. He had hired a cook. He was beginning to understand he had found something infinitely more. A routine, fragile at first, began to take root in the hard soil of the Blackwood Ranch. The days found their rhythm, marked not by the clock on the mantel that hadn't worked in years, but by the sun and the tasks it illuminated. Silas rose before dawn, the smell of coffee and frying bacon now greeting him instead of cold ash. He'd find Alara already moving about the kitchen, a quiet shadow in the pre-dawn gloom, a pot of oatmeal bubbling for Leo. They would eat in a comfortable silence, the clink of cutlery a language of its own. He'd head out to the fences, the herd, the endless war against entropy that was a rancher's life. But now, a change had settled over him. Before, the work had been a desperate scramble against ruin. Now, it felt different. It felt like building. When he'd looked back at the cabin from a high ridge, the thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney was no longer a signal of his lonely survival, but a beacon of the life taking hold within its walls. He found himself working with a renewed purpose, driven by more than just duty. Alara's domain expanded beyond the kitchen. One morning, Silas found her behind the cabin, turning over a patch of hard, unforgiving earth with a rusty spade. She was breaking up the clods with a fierce determination, her brow furrowed in concentration. He leaned against the corner of the house, watching her. "Ground's stubborn there," he said, his voice startling her. She looked up, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek with the back of her hand. "All ground is stubborn at first. You just have to persuade it." The next day, he left a better spade and a hoe leaning against the cabin wall for her. He said nothing about it, and she said nothing in return. But a week later, tiny green shoots were pushing their way through the soil. She was planting a garden. Radishes, lettuces, beans. It was an act of faith in a place that had seen little of it. Their lives began to overlap in small, necessary ways. The pump handle broke, and he found himself trying to explain the mechanism to her, so she could fetch water while he was gone. She listened intently, her head tilted, and then pointed to a worn leather washer. "Is this the part that's failed?" she asked. He was taken aback by her quick grasp of it. Together, they fashioned a new one from a scrap of old boot leather, their hands brushing in the close work. Her fingers were slender but strong, capable. The brief contact sent a jolt through him, an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. He, in turn, found himself relying on her observations. "The gray mare is favoring her left foreleg," she mentioned one evening as she served him stew. He'd been so focused on the fences he hadn't noticed. He checked the horse and found a stone wedged deep in the hoof, which could have led to a serious infection. Her quiet eyes saw everything. Leo, their small, shared son, orbited between them. He followed Alara around the cabin, chattering now, telling her about the shapes he saw in the clouds and the adventures of his wooden horse. He'd bring her treasures from the yard, a smooth stone, a hawk's feather, a misshapen wildflower. She accepted each gift with a solemn gravity that made the boy puff out his chest with pride. She taught him a song about a riverboat, and his small, piping voice filled the spaces that had once been hollow. One evening, as Alara was clearing the dinner plates, Silas noticed her pause by the shelf where Martha's sewing basket sat. She ran a finger over the dusty lid, her expression unreadable. Later that night, after Leo was asleep, he found her in the main room, the basket open in her lap. By the light of a single lamp, she was mending one of his shirts, the needle flashing in and out of the worn fabric with practiced ease. Martha's thimble, the one he'd bought her at a fair, was on Alara's finger. The sight struck him with a complicated force. It was intimate, domestic. It felt both deeply right and strangely wrong, like a betrayal and a blessing all at once. He saw the worn photograph of her husband, which she now kept on the small crate that served as her bedside table. He saw the way her shoulders sometimes slumped with a private weariness. They were two people haunted by ghosts, living in the same house, raising the same child, yet separated by the silent, uncrossable distance of their own grief. He was beginning to realize how much he wanted to cross it. The inevitable trip to redemption for supplies became a source of dread. Silas tried to put it off, but the flour bin was low and the salt was nearly gone. He decided they would all go. Leaving Alara and Leo alone for 2 days felt wrong. The wagon ride was pleasant enough. Leo sat between them, a happy buffer, pointing out prairie dogs and distant antelope. But as they rolled down the town's main street, Silas felt the familiar tightening in his gut. Heads turned. Curtains twitched in windows. He saw Mrs. Gable standing outside the mercantile, her arms crossed, her face a mask of sour piety. Her gaze swept over Silas, then lingered on Alara, taking in her plain dress and her quiet dignity with an air of open appraisal. Then her eyes dropped to Leo, who was holding Alara's hand. A look of profound disapproval settled on her features. Inside the store, Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was polite but cool. "Silas," he nodded. "Ma'am," he addressed Alara as if she were a piece of furniture. While Silas gave his list, other customers came and went, their greetings to him strained, their looks at Alara a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They were a puzzle the town was trying to solve, and they had already decided on the most scandalous solution. Alara seemed to shrink under the weight of their stares. Her composure, so steady at the ranch, became a fragile shield. She kept her eyes down, her hands clasped in front of her, her answers to Henderson's necessary questions clipped and quiet. Silas felt a hot surge of anger. These people, who had offered him nothing but platitudes in his grief, now sat in judgment of the first good thing to happen to his family in a year. As they loaded their supplies, Mrs. Gable made her approach. She moved like a ship under full sail, her black bombazine dress rustling with self-importance. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice carrying for all to hear. "A word, if I may." Silas stiffened. Mrs. Gable, her eyes, small and hard as pebbles, flicked to Alara, who was arranging sacks in the back of the wagon. "I must say, the town is concerned. A single woman, living under your roof, with a child in the house. It is not a proper arrangement. People are talking. It reflects poorly on the boy's upbringing." Each word was a carefully placed stone. Silas felt his hands clench into fists. He wanted to tell her it was none of her business. He wanted to defend Alara's honor, to shout that she was more decent and kind than anyone in this whole judgmental town. But he was a pragmatic man. He knew the power a woman like Mrs. Gable wielded. A word from her to the circuit judge, a whisper of impropriety, could bring a world of trouble he couldn't afford. "She's my hired cook," he said, his voice low and tight. "And a good one." "A cook," Mrs. Gable repeated, investing the word with a world of insinuation. "Of course. But you must consider appearances, Mr. Blackwood." For the boy's sake, she gave Alara one last, withering look and swept away, her mission accomplished. The ride home was silent. The easy camaraderie of the morning was gone, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension. Leo, sensitive to the shift, fell quiet, his head eventually drooping onto Alara's lap as he slept. Alara stared straight ahead, her back rigid, her face pale. The shield was back up, stronger than before. Silas felt the gulf between them widen into a chasm. The fragile home they had been building felt suddenly precarious, threatened by the whispers of a world that did not understand it. He looked at her, then at his sleeping son nestled against her, and a fierce, protective instinct rose in him. He wasn't just angry at the town. He was afraid. He was terrified of losing her. The chill of Mrs. Gable's words followed them back to the ranch, a frost that settled over the tentative warmth they had cultivated. Alara became more reserved, her movements once again confined to the strict boundaries of her employment. The easy smile she'd begun to share with Silas vanished, replaced by a polite, professional distance. The low humming in the kitchen ceased. She was still efficient, still kind to Leo, but a wall had gone up, brick by careful brick. She was protecting herself, and Silas knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that he and the town's gossip were the reason. He saw the toll it took in the small things. The way she'd flinch almost imperceptibly if he entered the kitchen unexpectedly. The way she'd busy her hands with a task, scrubbing a pot with unnecessary vigor, folding a dishcloth with painstaking precision, to avoid meeting his eyes. The shared, silent meals became strained, the air thick with unspoken words. He wanted to break the silence, to tell her that Mrs. Gable's opinion meant less than dust, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? Don't mind them. It's just my reputation you're ruining? The thought was bitter. He knew the burden of such gossip fell far heavier on a woman. A week after their trip to town, the circuit rider, Judge Miller, made his seasonal stop at the ranch. It was an expected visit. The judge often stayed a night with the more isolated ranchers on his route. But this time, it felt different. It felt like an inspection. Miller was a fair man, but stern, a product of the law he upheld. He accepted Silas's hospitality, but his gaze was assessing as he took in the clean cabin, the well-fed boy, and the quiet woman who served their dinner. After Leo was in bed, the two men sat by the fire, a bottle of whiskey between them. Alara had retired to her room, leaving them to their business. "Heard you hired some help, Silas," Miller began, swirling the amber liquid in his cup. "I did," Silas said, his voice neutral. "Mrs. Vance is a fine cook." "So I see." The judge took a slow sip. "I also hear talk in redemption. You know how people are. A situation like this, it can be misconstrued." Silas's jaw tightened. "There's nothing to misconstrue. I needed help. My son needed proper meals. Mrs. Vance needed a position. It's a simple arrangement." "Simple arrangements have a way of getting complicated," Miller said, his eyes on the fire. "I got a letter. Anonymous, of course. Full of scripture and concern for the boy's moral welfare." He sighed, a weary sound. "It's Mrs. Gable's handwriting. I'd know it anywhere." The air went out of Silas's lungs. It was no longer just gossip. It was a formal complaint, a seed of doubt planted in the mind of the law. "She's got no right," Silas managed, his voice hoarse. "Right has little to do with it," the judge countered, not unkindly. "It's about perception, and the law has a vested interest in the welfare of children. If a complaint is made, I have to look into it. If the talk continues, I could be compelled to have a formal hearing to determine if this is a suitable environment." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but terrifyingly clear. They could take Leo. The faceless, righteous law could decide he wasn't a fit father and tear his son away from him, all because he'd tried to give the boy a better life. The ranch, the work, his entire existence was for Leo. Without him, it was all just dust and wind. "What am I supposed to do, Judge?" Silas asked, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a cold dread. "Send her away? Let my son go back to eating burnt bacon and living in a sty? Let myself go half mad with work and worry? Is that a more suitable environment?" Judge Miller looked at him, his expression softening with a hint of sympathy. "I'm not telling you what to do, Silas. I'm telling you how it looks. And I'm telling you that you need to find a way to make it look different. A way to make it permanent. Unquestionable." He downed the last of his whiskey and stood. "I'm riding out at dawn. You're a good man, Blackwood. Don't let a bunch of gossips ruin what you've got here. Fix it." After the judge was gone, Silas sat by the dying fire for a long time, the man's words echoing in the quiet room. Fix it. The solution was as obvious as it was terrifying. It was a proposal born not of romance, but of necessity, a marriage of convenience, a legal shield to protect his son and keep this fragile peace. But could he ask that of her? To chain her life to his, not out of affection, but as a defense against meddling old women? It felt like another kind of transaction, another way of using her. He finally rose and walked to the door of her small room. He could hear the soft sound of her breathing within. He raised his hand to knock, but hesitated. What if she said no? He couldn't blame her. She would be free of the gossip, free to find a position where she wasn't a subject of scandal. He would lose her and the light she'd brought back into his home. But what if she said yes? What would that mean for them, for the ghosts they both carried? He let his hand fall. He couldn't do it. Not like this. Not as a business proposition in the middle of the night. He walked back to the hearth and sank into his chair, feeling more alone than he had in months. He stared into the glowing embers, the problem turning over and over in his mind. He had to tell her about the judge's visit, about the threat to Leo. She deserved to know the risk she was running by staying here. The conversation would have to happen tomorrow, and with it, everything would change, one way or another. The morning dawned heavy and gray, the sky a lid of tarnished silver. The conversation with Alara was as difficult as Silas had feared. He waited until after breakfast, until Leo had wandered outside to check a gopher trap he'd made. He found her by her small, burgeoning garden, her hands in the soil. He told her everything, his words stark and unadorned. He told her about Mrs. Gable's letter, about Judge Miller's warning, and about the threat to his custody of Leo. He watched her face as he spoke, saw the color drain from her cheeks. She pulled her hands from the dirt and wiped them on her apron, her movements slow and deliberate. When he finished, she didn't speak for a long time. She just stared at the neat rows of seedlings, their fragile green a stark contrast to the gravity of the news. "I see," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "I will pack my things. I can be gone by midday. It will solve the problem." Her words hit him like a physical blow. It was the logical response, the selfless response, and it was the one he dreaded most. "No," he said, the word rough, torn from him. "That doesn't solve anything. It just breaks it." She finally looked at him, her stormy eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness. "Mr. Blackwood, what other solution is there? My presence here is putting your son at risk. I cannot. I will not be the cause of that." "The judge," Silas began, his voice unsteady. He suggested a more permanent arrangement, one that would silence the talk. He couldn't bring himself to say the word marriage. It felt too sacred, too tied to Martha, and too transactional in this context. Alara's eyes widened slightly. She understood his meaning perfectly. A look of something akin to panic flashed across her face, followed by a profound sorrow. "As a business arrangement," she clarified, her voice flat. "A contract. To protect the boy." "Yes," he said, hating the word, hating the coldness of it. "But that's not. It's not just that." He struggled for the right words. Words that could bridge the chasm of their grief and the awkwardness of their situation. "Alara, what you've done here, for Leo, for this house, it's not something a contract can cover. You brought this place back to life. You brought him back to life." He took a half step closer. "I know you're still grieving. Lord knows I am too. I'm not asking you to replace anyone. I'm not asking for something you can't give. I'm just asking you not to go. I'm asking you to stay. We could make this official. We could make it a fortress against them." She looked away, toward the vast, empty plains that stretched to the horizon. He could see the conflict warring in her, the pull of self-preservation against the affection she'd clearly developed for Leo. She was being asked to trade her freedom, her future, for the thankless job of being a legal shield. "I need to think," she said, her voice strained. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, her shoulders slumped, leaving him standing alone by the hopeful green shoots of her garden. The rest of the day passed in a state of suspended animation. A thick, anxious silence filled the cabin, so heavy that even Leo seemed to feel it, playing quietly in his corner, his usual chatter stilled. The unspoken question lay between them, a massive weight. They were no longer just employer and employee, but two people at a precipice, forced to decide whether to leap together or retreat to their separate solitudes. The sun began its slow descent, flooding the cabin with a melancholy golden light. Alara moved through the motions of preparing the evening meal, her face a pale, unreadable mask. Silas sat at the table, oiling a piece of leather, the repetitive motion doing nothing to soothe the frantic turmoil in his mind. He had laid his desperation bare, and now he could do nothing but wait for her verdict. That evening, the tension was a third presence at the dinner table. The food was delicious, as always, but it tasted like ash in Silas's mouth. After the meal, as was now their custom, Alara took one of Martha's old storybooks from the shelf to read to Leo before bed. It was a ritual that had started weeks ago, a quiet time of day that Silas cherished from a distance. He would sit in the main room, listening to the murmur of her voice, the sound of balm on the raw edges of his loneliness. Tonight, he found he couldn't stay away. He stood in the shadows of the hallway, just outside Leo's open doorway, watching. The lamplight cast a warm, intimate glow on the scene. Alara sat on the edge of the cot, the book open in her lap. Leo was tucked under the covers, his head propped on his pillow, his eyes fixed on her face with rapt adoration. She finished the story about a brave little rabbit and closed the book, setting it on the small bedside crate. She reached out and smoothed his hair back from his forehead, her touch gentle and maternal. "Time for sleep now," she said softly. Leo didn't protest. He just lay there, watching her, a thoughtful expression on his small face. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the chirp of crickets outside and the soft sigh of the wind. Then, in the quiet, Leo spoke, his child's voice clear and unfiltered. piercing the heart of all the adult complications. "You make the house smell good," he said, his tone one of simple, factual observation. "You sing songs." Papa smiles more. He paused, his brown eyes serious and searching. "Will you be my mommy at bedtime, too?" The question hung in the air, perfect and devastating. It was not a question about cooks or housekeepers, about gossip or legal arrangements. It was a question about love, about belonging, about the shape of a family. It was the pure, simple truth of what they had all been feeling but had been too afraid or too broken to name. Silas saw Alara freeze. Her hand stilled in Leo's hair. Her breath hitched. Her carefully constructed walls, all the defenses she had built against hope and new heartbreak, crumbled in that one, shattering instant. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over and tracing silent paths down her pale cheeks. She didn't, or couldn't, answer. Silas stepped out of the shadows and into the doorway. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a wild drumbeat in the sudden, profound silence. Alara looked up, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the lamplight. Her eyes met his over the top of the child's head. In her gaze, he saw all her fear, all her grief, but he also saw a flicker of desperate, fragile hope. This was the true question, not from the judge, not from the town, but from the boy, and it demanded a true answer. The hypocrisy of the gossips, the cold logic of a marriage of convenience, it all burned away in the heat of that moment, leaving only the raw, undeniable need of the three of them. He wasn't just fixing a problem anymore. He was choosing a life. His gaze held hers, and in the quiet space of that shared look, he gave his answer. He didn't need words. He let her see the truth in his eyes. Yes. Please. Yes. A choked sob escaped her, a sound of sorrow and relief all at once. And through her tears, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. It was everything. He walked slowly into the room, the floorboards creaking softly under his weight. He didn't stop at the foot of the bed. He came around to the side and knelt on the floor beside her, his knees brushing the rough wood. He was no longer the employer, and she no longer the cook. They were just two people, brought together by loss, now bound by a child's hope. He reached out, his calloused, work-worn hand covering hers where it rested on Leo's quilt. Her fingers were cold, but they curled instinctively around his, clinging to him. Leo, watching them with wide, sleepy eyes, smiled. He snuggled deeper under the covers, his small body relaxing into a profound sense of security. The world outside, with its harsh judgments and cruel whispers, faded into insignificance. In the warm, golden lamplight of the small room, the three of them were a universe unto themselves. The air, which had been thick with tension and unspoken fears, was now filled with a quiet, trembling peace. The ghosts of the past did not vanish, but they receded, making space for a new beginning. Silas looked at Alara's tear-stained, beautiful face, and then at his son, who was already drifting into a peaceful sleep, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was finally home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.